November 1919. A fallen emperor sits in a Dutch manor house, House Doorn. The steady is quiet, too quiet. There are no generals, there are no ministers, there are no cheering crowds. Just papers and silence. On the desk lies a newspaper announcing the collapse of the German Empire. 30 years earlier, he had ruled one of the most powerful nations on Earth, and now, he is just simply Wilhelm. He once commanded millions of soldiers, and now he commands nothing. He believed that he was chosen by God to rule, that history would vindicate him, that Germany's destiny was written in iron and blood. And instead, his empire is gone, his throne has been abolished, and his people are exhausted by war. How does a man go from ruling Europe's rising superpower to watching it vanish? Was he reckless? Was he naive? Or was he the last monarch of a world that was already collapsing beneath him? Because Wilhelm didn't just lose a war, he lost an entire era. The old Europe of kings, cavalry, and divine right. And in its place came trenches, revolutions, and a century defined by total war. To understand how it fell apart, we have to go back to the summer of 1888, when a young emperor took the throne and believed that the future belonged to him. Alright, hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of The Civic Mandate. I'm very excited about this episode. This episode is about 2 months in the making, maybe more. I put a lot of research, a lot of effort, and a lot of time into this episode. And I really hope that you guys enjoy it. I hope it does well. But most importantly, this was a really interesting subject to talk about. Talking about the fall of the aristocracy. We're talking about Europe in a complete change, liberal democracies, revolutions. Fascinating era, and I think most people agree with me with it being an incredibly fascinating era. This episode is going to be an 8-act. There's going to be 8 different acts in this episode, and we're going to be talking about Kaiser Wilhelm, and we're going to be talking about his reign, both his reign during the war and his exile, and we're also going to be talking about before he even ever came to power and his early reign. We're going to be talking about kind of the misconceptions about him, the attacks, the unjust attacks, and I'm going to be defending him in a way. This is going to be an episode, I have a couple more of these planned out, where I take a controversial leader from history, and I defend them a little bit. I support them, and I'm not saying that he was an amazing Kaiser, because he lost Germany. He lost. But what I am saying is there are some attacks against him that are uncalled for, some attacks against him that just simply aren't necessary. Some attacks against him that are very clearly propagandized and they have an agenda. So, with that said, we're going to get straight into Act 1. Kaiser Wilhelm was the villain that history needed for World War I. Propaganda has an interesting purpose. How can I make my enemy look bad? How can I make my people want to fight for my nation, feel patriotic? And also, how can I make my enemy look like the evil one? How can I make my enemy look like the one who is spreading propaganda, and not myself? You see, in World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm is attacked by British propaganda emphasizing his withered arm, which he had had since he was a kid, that he had learned to overcome and use his other hand. And also he had learned to shoot a gun, he had learned to ride a horse, and all of that with his withered arm. But he was attacked for it, and it was made out to be a far larger issue than it actually was. He was also attacked for his militaristic uniforms and his spiked helmet. Very odd things to attack him for, right? But that's what the British propaganda emphasized. He was depicted as a mad autocrat, complete and utter power over Germany, a barbarian from the east, and the sole instigator of the war. What you have to realize is Europe needed a villain to pin all the blame on. Because Austro-Hungary was collapsing, In the end, they were not going to be able to pay any reparations. They were not going to be able to face the consequences for it. They were a dying empire. But Germany, who England had had a long-standing rivalry with for decades and decades, needed to be knocked down a couple pegs. Maybe knocked down all the way. Maybe knocked down to ground one. That's the lines that they were thinking. If you look at the Treaty of Versailles, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, placed the blame directly on Germany alone. Political necessity required that they identify guilt. There had to be some sort of personification of the guilt for the war. There was no room for nuance. There was no room for actual investigation. Wilhelm, of course, was the emperor at the time of the war, and he became almost a lightning rod, or a symbolic lightning rod, for the guilt for the war. But the reality check for that comes in when you look at, by 1916, the German High Command under Hindenburg dominated policy. Kaiser Wilhelm did not dare to remove Hindenburg from power, even though he was basically controlling the government, because he knew if Hindenburg left, then Germany was at a loss. They couldn't afford to lose Hindenburg because he was the only one keeping the German war machine alive. By 1918, the Kaiser was effectively sidelined. He had lost power in the Reichstag. He had lost power among the political halls of Berlin and Potsdam. So he was over on the border, hiding out with his troops, who he still held loyalty to. And he was not actively influencing German politics by any means. So that raises the question, if he could truly control everything, if he had autocratic power over Germany, if he is a sole instigator of the war, then how did he lose control of his own state? Perhaps there's more to the story here. The core theme you see here is that he became a caricature of World War I, the villain that they all needed, because history prefers villains over systems. They don't want to see the patterns that are developing here. Instead, they want to personify the issue. That is where propaganda gets you. You don't have the truth, you have a half-truth. At worst, you have a complete lie. And that brings us into Act 2. We're going to get into Kaiser Wilhelm in his beginnings. He was better known as Frederick William Victor Albert when he was born in 1859. And due to birth complications when he was born, he had a damaged left arm, which required painful physical therapy, including shock treatment and various other painful things that they had to do to his arm. They tried to bring it back, and in the end it just seemed to do worse rather than better. But he was raised to conquer his weakness through sheer willpower. His father was Frederick III, who was liberal-minded, and he was an Anglophile. He supported England, and he didn't have quite the same patriotism or nationalism that his son would have later in his rule. Wilhelm's mother was Victoria and was the Princess Royal, the daughter of Queen Victoria. And his mother was a complete Anglophile and oftentimes led his father around. His father was a weak-minded man who had no opinions of his own. Whatever his wife said was basically that's what he went with. So this was a very interesting family that he grew up in. His dynasty was one of the Hohenzollern, and it was a militaristic dynasty. It was a Prussian aristocracy. And it's odd, his mother criticized him as a young man for being, quote, too Prussian, and he often felt patronized by his English relatives. He developed a deep insecurity that was kind of masked by a sort of theatrical confidence. His tutor, George Hinspeter, was very strict, and that's actually how Wilhelm overcame his crippled arm, was through his tutor basically saying, look, dude, you're going to have to deal with this your whole life. Let's get it over with now. So he to make him ride a horse, he made him keep getting up on a horse every time he fell off because of his bad arm, until finally he could ride a horse. This is the sort of life he grew up in. He was sent to school with middle-class boys to learn about his future subjects, and he had an early exposure to the rising liberal socialist Germany in a way. He idolized as a young man Barbarossa, Otto I, and the Holy Roman Imperial legacy. He had a desire to have a return to those values. The core theme you notice in this man's young life and childhood is that he was raised for an age of divine monarchy in a century where parliaments ruled, where constitutional monarchies were far more common, and socialism was just on the horizon. Mass politics. What you saw was the democratization of Europe looming over the crumbling aristocracy. Not that he would have noticed this at the point. He would have been in his teenage years. But this is the world he was born into. He was born into a monarchy that was dying out, and a monarchy that in the end, he would end up dying along with. 1888, often called the year of three emperors. Wilhelm I dies. That is Kaiser Wilhelm's grandfather. And then after that, Kaiser Wilhelm's father, Frederick III, reigns for a total of 99 days. He had been suffering from throat cancer for almost a year. Of course, not helped by his meddling wife, who dragged him around Europe. And in the end, there was a major issue over whether or not his surgeon would be an Englishman or a German. Let's just say his wife was not looking out for the best for him. And then, finally, when his father died, the 29-year-old Wilhelm inherited the empire. Now, there have been many issues brought up with this. Was he too young? Did he not have enough battlefield command experience that he would have needed in the war? He didn't have a very long apprenticeship in governance, or his emotional maturity that was still forming. I do ascribe to this idea. I do feel like Kaiser Wilhelm came to the throne far too early, and if he had come to the throne even 5 or 10 years later, I think it would have been a much different story. He would have been set in policy. Perhaps he would have gotten some battlefield command experience in Africa, because his father was certainly more interventionist than Wilhelm I. So I could see him as crown prince being sent to Africa to gain some battlefield command, which would have been very useful in World War I. He also did serve under Bismarck for a while, learning about governance. But this could have lasted far longer before he came to power, and he could have had a greater grasp on politics. That's oftentimes one of the major critiques about him. And he was often seen as emotionally unstable. I believe this can be chalked up to the fact that he came into power at far too young of an age, and it was a lot of stress. People oftentimes don't want to talk about that, but I mean, he's a 29-year-old man. And all of a sudden you put him in on the throne of a rising empire. Mind you, an empire coming to the world scene very late, but a rising empire nonetheless, and give him all the stressors of running that. I could definitely see how that would cause a sort of emotional breakdown, or an emotional dysregularity. Now back to Otto von Bismarck. Some say, and I can understand why they say this, one of the greatest German statesmen that's ever ruled. But at the time that Wilhelm took power, he was aging, very rigid, and he was quite suspicious. He was set in his ways. He enjoyed his position a little too much. A lot of his aides said that he would oftentimes be a little lazy with his work. He wouldn't quite get to things that were sent to him fast enough. And he was but that doesn't mean that he wasn't a bad statesman. At this point, he was genuinely one of the best statesmen that had ever, at least in that time period, he was one of the best German statesmen ever. And he certainly attempted to manipulate the Reichstag politics, and he was very right-wing. He was a pan-German, for sure. He was very set in his ways. He's very set in his policies, unlike Kaiser Wilhelm. Bismarck was dismissed in 1890 over an issue in foreign policy. He and Wilhelm disagreed on a Franco-Russian alliance. Wilhelm was not too worried with preventing it, whereas Bismarck was quite worried about preventing it. So when Wilhelm didn't sign the reassurance treaty with Russia, which would have guaranteed Russia's neutrality in the event of a German war with France, that is when things started to take a downturn. And then after a series of conflicts, Otto von Bismarck was dismissed. Was this a mistake? Certainly. This was a major mistake. This was a major mistake. Because Wilhelm was not yet set in his policy, he needed more mature people around him to help him kind of get through this very sticky situation that would happen. Of course, Otto von Bismarck would have died by then. Anyways, the war was still 24 years away. But he would have given Germany a far better political position than they were in then. So the kind of core theme here is that the strategic drift began to happen very early in Wilhelm's regime, but the inevitability of their defeat did not. That came far later. I would honestly say probably within the years of the war. So, yes, it was a mistake to get rid of Bismarck. Bismarck was a very experienced leader, and that's something that the young Wilhelm needed. But also, what you see is major influences from both his mother, Victoria, who is still around, influencing her son, and various other influences around him. He surrounded himself with people who didn't really like the Pan-Germans, who didn't really like the Junkers. And that is part of the reason, in my opinion, that he did end up dismissing him, an issue over an alliance. In the end, major flaw. Probably, in my opinion, the most major blunder of his whole entire rule. Alfred von Tirpitz, the naval mastermind behind Germany, a brilliant man who strived to see Germany have a very powerful fleet, and in the end, his dream did not come to what he had wished. But he was a man with great ambitions, and under different circumstances, perhaps he could have achieved his dream. In the late 1890s and the early 1900s, Germany had a desire for a large navy. They wanted to be in direct competition with England. England had a lot of overseas colonies, and Germany also desired overseas colonies. But to do that, you needed a strong naval power to protect your various trade, and also to extend your military reach. Naval power was a perfect way to project your power from beyond the mainland of Europe and into Africa and other areas where Germany had colonies. Part of the things that brought on this naval expansion was Germany's industrial boom at the turn of the century, which included an increase in coal, steel, and population growth. There was a desire for a place in the sun, or African colonies. Now, they were very late to the colonial race. Nations had been at it for 600 years, and Germany was just now getting involved in it. And there was a little bit of a prestige thing too. Germany, as I said, was a rising empire and felt the need to prove themselves to these already long-established empires. And the reaction that England had to this was as to be expected. They felt a direct threat to their naval superiority because it was essential for England because of their self-conscious realization that they could never beat Germany on land, and the only way to really beat them was on the sea. And of course, for those of you who know your history, that is in the end how England beat Germany in World War I, was the naval blockade. So they interpreted the German fleet, or the building of a German fleet, as a quite overt offensive threat. Whether or not it was, I'm inclined to say it was far more defensive, if anything, because England did have complete supremacy over European waters, and Germany felt a little threatened by them, actually, and they wanted to have a fleet to protect their overseas colonies. I don't think it was meant to be in direct competition with England, so there's a little bit of a miscalculation on Wilhelm's part. What he saw was that a fleet equaled leverage, both colonial and in the area around Europe. But England took that completely different, and they thought that a fleet meant preparation for war. So They were preparing for war with Germany. The arms race here is basically one of mutual suspicion. It's not that Germany had bad relations with England, although of course this slowly built to them having a sort of rivalry with them. But they were definitely suspicious of what the other was planning. There was media escalation. England's media was just like a pain in the butt and just basically did anything they could to stir the pot and make any drama out of nothing. And there was diplomatic cooling. People didn't want to talk to each other. Kaiser Wilhelm was booed every time he went to England. So the thing here is just the intent versus the perception. So the intent for Germany was not to directly compete with England or to threaten England, but that's the perception that they got, is that this is war, they're trying to threaten us, they're trying to intimidate us, which was not at all what Germany was attempting to do. So really what you see here is Wilhelm is simply, you remember Wilhelm was completely mocked by his family in England, and he was patronized, and what you see here is just an extension of that. Wilhelm was not taken seriously, and that's a major issue. Act 5 is about the Daily Telegraph incident. This is in 1908. What you have here was an interview with Wilhelm that was published without there being sufficient review by the German High Command to kind of pick out what he was actually saying. The issue was, it kind of displayed for the German people how erratic he was and how many contradictory statements that he did make. He praised Britain while also criticizing the German public opinion, which hated Britain. And the domestic backlash was pretty furious. The Reichstag was furious, obviously. The political elite felt embarrassed because they're the ones who let it slip through the cracks. And the military establishment definitely began to lose a lot of confidence in him. But this is when the military started to wake up to the fact that, he doesn't really have a foreign policy. Like, if we go to war, we're cooked. Like, we don't know who we're fighting. So this is when they kind of started to wake up to that. What you saw after this is that the power dynamic started to shift away from Kaiser Wilhelm and towards the ministers and generals that surrounded him. And he became kind of increasingly symbolic. That's not to say that he didn't have power. He definitely had power in the German Empire. A lot of people, when they hear stuff like that, they're like, that just means he's a figurehead, like Emperor Hirohito, like in Japan during World War II. That's not true. Kaiser Wilhelm had a lot of power still. And it wasn't sort of like this constitutional monarchy or even the monarchy that we see in England with no power. Instead, what it was is that his leaders would subtly or not so subtly influence him. They'd say, hey, you should make this policy. Hey, you should do this. Or they would threaten to resign unless he made a certain policy. And that is, in the end, how they exerted their influence over Kaiser Wilhelm. And after 1908, he was certainly no longer the sole driver of foreign policy. Before 1908, there were other minor players, but after that, Kaiser Wilhelm kind of took a back seat. Franz Ferdinand and Nicholas II, two great players in this play that is Kaiser Wilhelm's life. Franz Ferdinand was a close friend of Wilhelm, at least in their earlier years. They hunted together, they played sports together. And Nicholas II, of course, was Kaiser Wilhelm's cousin, and they exchanged many letters that have been very famously dubbed the Nicky and Willie letters. You see this terrible event happen, which is the, in my opinion, crumbling and dying out Austro-Hungarian Empire, have their Archduke executed in cold blood by a Serbian nationalist. State-sponsored terror is what it was. And then Germany is basically giving Austria a blank check to crush Serbia for what they did. But they don't expect it to ever spill out into anything else. Back when Austria seized Bosnia, Germany was actually embarrassed. They did not expect Austria to do that, and they actually basically told Austria, like, you shouldn't have done that, that was a bad idea. They were dealing with many other, like, the perception of Austria-Hungary and Germany was kind of these expansionist empires, and they're like, dude, you're not helping us here. So they did not always support Austrian expansion. That's a good thing to point out, because that doesn't mean Germany just blanketly accepted. There was quite a bit of aggression on the Austrian part, but they did not accept that by any means. Now, the execution of an Austrian nobleman was by no means good retribution for this. Now, Wilhelm's position at this time, he was on vacation, and he believed that Russia was unlikely to mobilize to support Serbia. And he writes to Nicholas, actually, urging restraint. He's like, look, dude, we don't need to go into a full war. A fellow nobleman was just murdered. We need to stop this. But the problem was, Russia was already mobilizing, and Nicholas's advisors were very anti-German. So when Willie wrote to Nicky and said, hey, dude, you gotta stop it. Like, you gotta stop the mobilization. This is gonna spill onto something we're not gonna be able to stop. That's when Nicholas's anti-German advisors stepped in and said, oh no, we're gonna keep this going. And they basically pushed Nicholas II out of the way and said, no, Russia's going to keep mobilizing. We're going to go to war with Germany. Now, it's worth saying that Nicholas tried to stop the mobilization. He did not want the war to continue. He really liked Wilhelm by all measures, and he really did not want a German and Russian war. Now, kind of the structural trap that Germany did fall into here is that the mobilization timetables were rather inflexible. So they needed to basically take immediate action against France for fear of encirclement, because Russia comes in, France comes in, and then they're kind of done for. And then, of course, the British blockade. Although at this point, the British had assured the Germans that they would stay neutral, which, of course, they didn't. The sort of escalation spiral that happened here is that Russia began to mobilize way faster than Germany predicted. So Germany mobilizes, and then France is drawn in as a result of the war with Russia. Britain then enters after Germany, attempting to take out France in 6 weeks, very fast, attempts to bypass all of the French border forts by going through Belgium, which of course triggers England to go to war since they had a neutrality guarantee on Belgium. So once the mobilizations began, the monarchs kind of had limited control. The military high commands began to take over. And kind of the key line to emphasize here is that Wilhelm miscalculated Austria's resolve to go to war and to continue this. Because remember, Serbia accepted a lot of the agreements that Austria put forward when Austria said, hey, look, you just killed our Archduke, like, you need to follow all this. Serbia accepted most of them, except they wouldn't allow Austrian police to operate in Serbia. And also, Wilhelm did not expect Russia's reaction. He expected to be able to talk Wilhelm out of it, or to talk Nicholas out of it, say, hey, look, dude, we don't need war here. We don't need war among the noblemen. And to be entirely fair, it would have worked if Nicholas's advisors hadn't been so anti-German. Russia and Germany never would have gone to war together. But this is by no means saying that Wilhelm orchestrated it. He supported his allies in their war against the state-sponsored terrorism of Serbia. He supported their allies there, and then he expected to fall back on this friendship, this relationship that he had with Nicholas. But in the end, that never happened, creating this spiral that went down and down and down. This was not Wilhelm's fault. In Act 7, we're going to dive into this power that was taken away from Wilhelm during the war. I'm going to introduce two people to you here. Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. These two were very successful generals. They are the ones who defeated the Russians. They mopped up the Eastern Front, encircling tens of thousands of Russians. And there was no chance the Russians had, because these men were so brilliant. Then they brought over to the Western Front, and similarly, they did quite well there too. And in 1916, they had Falkenhayn removed, who was at that point the military high command chief, and Hindenburg and Ludendorff began to rise through the ranks. They took his place there. And essentially what it was is basically a military dictatorship, but with some interesting caveats. So what happened was Hindenburg and Ludendorff were one of the probably some of the most successful German generals to have ever existed, beyond maybe Rommel. They were just incredibly brilliant men, but they knew how to shift the levers of power too. They weren't just military men, they were political men for sure. So what they would do is very tricky what they would do. They were in such a place that they could orchestrate Germany's military. They could decide who goes where, and they could dictate grand strategy, is what they could do. And like I said, they're brilliant men, so it was a good place for them, too. And in my opinion, they're what kept Germany going as long as it did, kept them so cohesive. But it undermined Kaiser Wilhelm's authority, because what they would do is they would say, hey, look, I want you to do this, this, this in policy. They would tell Wilhelm that. And Wilhelm would say, well, I don't want to do that. Then they would threaten resignation. And Wilhelm didn't want them to resign, because if they resigned, then Germany was cooked. They were Germany was holding on to, the kind of the hope that they were clinging on to, that they could make it out of the war with at least some decent territory. Wilhelm began to be sidelined because he couldn't dismiss the generals. And the peace overtures that they tried to give were ignored. Hindenburg would not let them surrender. He would not let them go to the peace table unless they got some of the land that their troops are occupying. He said, the land that we're occupying right now, we're not going to give it up. If we're occupying it, it's ours. And that is when the parliamentary pressure began to turn on Wilhelm. And essentially it was a coup. Someone called it a half abdication in a way. So what you have in 1918 is just a complete collapse of the war. The blockade begins to induce insane starvation in Germany. The Bulgarians surrender, which Wilhelm felt very betrayed by, because literally a week prior, the Bulgarian king had come by and said, hey, look, we're going to fight. And in the end, they didn't. And then the Allied offensives obviously were the final blow. Wilhelm had pressure from both the right and the left to step down. And with revolutions brewing, he did, in the end, step down. He didn't want to step down. He went back on saying he stepped down after he said, yeah, I'll abdicate. He actually tried to go back on it, but by at that point, the message had gotten out, and he had essentially abdicated the throne as emperor. He still retained the title of Prussian king, but in the end, it didn't matter, because he fled to the Netherlands, he fled to Holland, and that's where he would live out his exile. The absolute monarch, as people like to call him, couldn't even command his own command structure, and in the end was forced to abdicate. He didn't make the decision, he was forced. Now this begins our final act, Act 8. And in my opinion, this is one of the most interesting parts of this story, is Wilhelm's life at Doorn, House Doorn, which is the house that he bought in Holland. That's where he lived out the rest of his life. What you see here is not a defeated monarch. Well, you see that. You see it come out at certain points. You see a desire to return to the monarchy, but you also see a subtle shift. Actually, maybe more than subtle. Because during his rule, what you saw was erratic behavior. He would constantly shift from one policy to the next, mental breakdowns, emotional moments. He was by no means intellectually stable, in my opinion. But at Doorn, he began to run in intellectual circles. He hosted conferences, and they studied classical works, and he had genuine regret over the dismissal of Bismarck. He realized, in his old age, that was a bad idea. 1933, he said, I should not have dismissed Bismarck. He acknowledged that. There was serious introspection on his part. He looked back, and he said, this was a mistake. I should not have dismissed this man who had far more experience than me. Perhaps he could have changed the course of my rule. That is something you see from a changed man. I think Wilhelm was a changed man after the war. You see that he was incredibly skeptical of the Nazis. The Nazis came multiple times to Doorn and said, Göring did twice, and he was like, look, dude, we'll bring back the monarchy. We will restore you to power. But Wilhelm knew they wouldn't actually give him any power. He would do basically what his son did, which was his son joined the Nazis and was used as a mascot of sorts for them. And in the end, his son died a broken man in 1949. Wilhelm didn't want that life. He didn't want that. So he's incredibly skeptical of the offers that the Nazis gave him. The Dutch, who were essentially keeping Wilhelm, after the war, there was much pressure for the Dutch to extradite Wilhelm from Doorn and face trial for his supposed crimes. But in the end, they refused. They would not let William go. They're like, look, we gave him asylum. We let him stay here. We're not going to give him up to your courts. And it's interesting, actually. There was a story. 8 officers, American officers, snuck into Dorn, and they tried to kidnap Wilhelm and bring him to court. And of course, his advisors realized that very quickly, that they were trying to kidnap him. So they called the police, and the police removed them. Wilhelm was quite amused. He thought it was funny, and I think in the end, he was just a very intellectual, serious man. And he seriously looked back on his life, and he saw the flaws that were there, the obvious flaws. Another interesting story about him is that he was a kind man. He chopped down 20,000 trees in his exile. After he got done with work, and as part of his routine, he would just go out and chop down trees, chop up firewood, and he would give the firewood to the needy, to the poor. He was a good man. He's a good man. He supported the community that he lived in. This man was very interesting to read about. He lived until 1941. He ended up dying at the age of 82, and he died being the symbol of German aggression, being the scapegoat, in a sense. What you saw after his exile, what you saw as he began to settle down, he remarried after his wife died, and he started to contemplate life. I think what you start to see is that maybe him being emperor was actually never would have been a good thing. Maybe under other circumstances it could have been a more successful reign, but maybe he would have operated better as an intellectual, as an interlocutor, as I think he could have had a far more successful career in politics, just maybe not as emperor. Now, of course, he had no choice in the matter. He was the crown prince, and in the end, he did end up taking power. But I wonder what his life could have been like if he had been in a different position. He was a brilliant man. He was a smart man. I think he just couldn't deal with the stress of the position. But I think it is an insane stretch to say that he is the cause for the war, because he did make diplomatic mistakes. He was not a diplomat, in my opinion. He was also not a general, which is why he had his high command take over a lot of the responsibilities for that. He was, especially in his younger reign, impulsive. He misjudged both Britain and Russia, but of course, I don't think it's his fault with the Russian thing. He overestimated Austria and overestimated their power, and he didn't think that they were going to keep pushing it with Serbia, but they did. And he underestimated modern mass politics, the populist movements that began to surface, the socialist populist movements that began to surface after his reign. But it's important to remember, he did not engineer a continental war plan. It's not like he was an Adolf Hitler planning and he wanted to conquer. He wanted to start a new German Reich that encompassed the whole entire German globe. Actually, he didn't even want the war to start in the first place. He tried hard so many times to stop the war. He had a mental breakdown when the war did happen because he couldn't keep the peace. But he kept working at it. He kept trying. And he even said, even when the war was in full swing, he said, any land we conquer, we're going to give back. Because what he wanted wasn't a new empire, an expanded empire. What he wanted was a new economic bloc. He wanted a United States of Europe. And of course, you can't blame him. He lost control of the military by 1916. And he saw localized conflict and not a world war by any means. He wanted retribution in Serbia. He wanted the Austrians to, at the very least, exact some sort of justice for their leader being butchered. But he didn't want a full continental war by any means. And what you see here is that there was already a system in place that made this war expand to what it did. The alliance system that existed and the mobilization structures of Russia, of France, of England, they made the escalation likely regardless of personality, regardless of if Wilhelm was the best emperor that had ever existed. This war would have happened either way, in my opinion. Wilhelm was the last romantic emperor of Europe. He was ambitious, insecure, theatrical in some ways, but he was trapped in an industrial system of alliances and war planning that no monarch could ever fully control. And in the end, by 1914, he had one of the most robust economies that Germany had ever had. Coal, steel production was up. Their military was the most powerful military on the mainland. And in the end, he did provide success for Germany in his reign. Perhaps not as good as it could have been. He was born into his position as emperor. He was born into his position as emperor in a dying age of an aristocracy, the monarchies which were collapsing. In the end, I would say he was a good man. He was a kind man. And he was a man who was willing to criticize even himself. Doesn't mean he didn't criticize others, but he criticized himself. Maybe sometimes a little too harshly. He had serious introspection at the end of his life. And in a way, this story is quite sad, because what you see here is the last king of Germany. The last Kaiser, the last man of Prussian descent to ever hold the throne. You have to have a certain amount of sadness for that. A dying aristocracy. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it was decently long, and I hope to do more videos in this style. So tell me if you enjoyed it. Tell me if you liked this style of video. I just want to say, guys, I love you. I thank you so much for making this channel what it is. You guys are the only reason this can ever happen. So I really appreciate it, and I hope you guys enjoy the next video that'll be coming out very soon on General E. Lee. That'll be quite controversial, and I know that. So, hope you guys have a great day, and God bless.